Okay, so welcome back. I hope you had a little break. And also I'm hoping that you managed to read the key readings that I've asked you to do before this session. So you were asked to do key reading 1 and 2, and what I'd just like you to do now is to pause the recording and actually just have a little think about some of the ideas that were covered in key reading. And what I want you to do particularly is, based on your reading of these texts, I want you to have a think about what concepts and ideas you think will underpin this unit. So take a few minutes to think about this and record your thoughts, and then I will share what the main ideas that we hope to cover over the next few weeks. So what concepts and ideas, based on that reading, do you think will underpin this unit, which is on leading and managing people in education? Right, so welcome back. I want you to just store your thoughts from that previous task, which was to consider what you think the key concepts that will underpin this unit are going to be. And then the other thing that I asked you to do before this session was the starting points task. And I would like you again to just find that starting points task, which was really just getting you to reflect on your experience of being managed or managing, and then think about the following question and compile a response to this question. And what I'm going to do on Thursday in the live session is give you an opportunity to discuss this with your course mates. And this is, what do you think are the most important key skills or knowledge about managing others that managers in schools need to possess? So hopefully many of you have got experience of being managed, or you are indeed managers yourself, so you'll have something to reflect on here. So the most important key skills or knowledge about managing others that the manager needs to possess. So pause the recording at this point, have a think about that, make a few notes, and then you're going to bring those along to the live session on Thursday, and I will provide an opportunity for you to discuss that with your course mates. So some of the other things that I would like you to think about, and that are going to underpin some of our thoughts from this session, is why we think that successful management of people in education is actually important. And then the other thing that I think is really important to consider is the issues in today's educational landscape that successful management of people might aim to address. So we want to make sure that we're aware of the most up-to-date issues and the events that shape the educational landscape of today that will influence the way that people may go about managing people in schools. So I wanted us to consider why managing people is a really important issue. And these, I think, are the reasons why. So these are the sort of key issues that are particularly pertinent for UK schools or English schools, which mean that actually thinking about the way we manage educational institutions is really important. I've got right in the middle there this issue of well-being. We know that well-being is a key issue amongst teaching staff, particularly our teaching workforce, and that actually it's very well documented now, both in research but also in the press and by the media, that lots of teachers, or a high proportion of teachers, suffer poor well-being as a result of the pressures associated with their jobs. So it becomes a very important issue for school managers. And then the reason why that one's right in the middle, and then we've got these other ones around it, is because actually poor well-being can have an influence on these other things. We know that retention of staff is an issue in UK schools. The government has an aim to keep teachers in the profession for at least 5 years after they train, and a very high proportion, and it's over 40% of teachers do not stay in the profession for that long. So retention is a real issue, and this high turnover of staff is a big issue for managers, because that creates problems for schools and also for pupils. So it's not only keeping teachers there, but actually getting people to want to train to be a teacher in the first place. So recruitment of teachers and also recruitment of teachers to particular schools. This is a huge factor for managers and for leaders, because some schools may get no teachers at all applying for positions that are advertised in their different departments. So it's a big issue for managers. The other idea is one around standards. So the most influential factor on the way that pupils will perform in schools, or the most influential factor on pupil outcomes, is good teaching. So clearly this is a very important issue for managers and leaders in school. And then in representation, what I mean by that is that it's looking at the makeup of the workforce in terms of who we see represented in managers. It's one of the things that we'll talk about in the week where I'm looking at gender, because actually what we're really talking about when we're talking about gender issues in management is the underrepresentation of women in management and leadership positions in schools. So those are some of the things that I've picked out, which I think make management of people in education a really important issue. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to have a look at the historical overview, so to provide you with some historical context for the current position of issues in relation to management of people in education. We're going to go back to the 19th century and the Industrial Revolution. So these are all the things here that I'm going to talk about, sort of provide the backdrop for how the concepts related to management have evolved through time. Let's start with the Industrial Revolution and this chap called Robert Owen. So what he actually did way back in the 19th century, we're talking about around about 1870, when the Industrial Revolution was just really beginning to happen. He actually was already talking then about better working and living conditions for employees. And he actually wrote a series of essays called The New View of Society. And the reason why this is important is that actually some of these ideas that we're talking about in terms of management of people, not just in education, but in all settings, have been around for a long time, 150 years. And this chap as well, Charles Babbage, he actually wrote something in 1832. So we're talking even before the height of the Industrial Revolution. He wrote something called On the Economy of Machineries and Manufacturers. And this was basically looking about the advantages of a profit sharing program and the idea that the well-being of employees is really important and it can lead to better work. He actually described it as perfect work. But actually it's really just, recognizing even at that early date that looking after your employees and considering these ideas and how your employees are managed was already becoming a more popular concept, and it remains so today as well. So in the early 20th century, we begin to think about the ideas of Taylorism. So this is the principles or practice of scientific management and work efficiency. And those were practiced in this system, which was known as the Taylor system, which really sort of was aiming for this economic efficiency. So he suggested a theory of management. So this is when we begin to see people beginning to talk about the fact that you can develop a theory in order to promote effective approaches around management. And it really was, his theory was focusing on improving economic efficiency. But it contains some elements that are still very relevant today, such as work ethic. It talked about ideas around mass production, knowledge transfer between workers, so training, ideas of training, and having actually structured programs and things in place in order to improve economic efficiency. So hopefully you can see that those are ideas that are still relevant to managers today and in schools. So next we're going to move on to post-World War I. And actually it was at this point that we had the National Institute of Industrial Psychology was established. And this was a non-profit making scientific organisation, and it was really created for the study of industry and commerce. But what it aimed to do was to promote the application of psychology and physiology within these fields. So it conducted research into problems in the industrial and commercial sector, and it published that research. And it actually began to, it expanded rapidly in the 60s. And sadly, funding was withdrawn by the end of that decade. But what it did was it actually contributed a body of knowledge to begin to think about some of the acute problems that were facing organisations to support effective management as well. Then we've got Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm just going to slip onto the next slide and we'll go back again. So some of you will be very familiar with Maslow, but this was a theory that was developed in the 1940s. And actually what Maslow's theory does is it gives a much more humanistic approach to management approaches. So rather than a very authoritarian approach, it actually creates, it's a theory that promotes ideas around motivation, around team decision-making, around personal fulfillment in order to try and promote organizational productivity. So the principle is, if you look at this pyramid here, so basically Maslow said that if your workers don't have their basic physiological needs met, so this is air, water, food, shelter, sleep and sex as well, then actually they won't be in a position to feel safe and secure. So those things need to be in place. So people basically need to be fed, watered and have a proper working environment in order to feel safe and secure. And then once people feel safe and secure and maybe part of an organization, then they may develop a sense of belongingness. And that actually builds a sense of self-esteem. And it's only once those basic needs have been met and that employees have a feeling of self-esteem that they will achieve self-actualization, which actually means that they're able to fulfill their potential really and be able to do their job to the best of their ability. So, and if we go into this in a little bit more detail, he said, while a need is unsatisfied, it remains a motivator and it dominates thoughts until it's fulfilled. So it takes people's mind off the job because they're focusing on needing their needs to be satisfied. And then once those are satisfied, the employee moves up to the next level. And then if the needs are unfulfilled, that's going to have an impact on an organisation in terms of turnover and decreased performance. So if you get into a position where needs are fulfilled, then that's going to benefit the organisation and there will be better turnover and better performance. So let's go back then. So the next concept that has historically evolved and still influences management today is this idea of industrial relations. So it has its roots in the Industrial Revolution, it's basically when society was wrestling with huge economic and social changes, which actually created labour problems. There were low wages, there was long working hours, work was monotonous and dangerous, and sometimes there was quite abusive practices taking place in the workplace. So it led to a very high turnover of employees, strikes, violent strikes, and also the threat of social instability. So that was the era in response to labour problems and a lot of conflict in the workplace that unions began to be developed, and there was some regulation in jobs that began to take place. So this idea of industrial relations to solve some of those problems in relation to the labour force. Then we've got this idea of personnel administration and human resource management as well. Those are two things that we will talk about a little bit later on in this session. And this was really to aim to maximise employee productivity. And so this was about developing departments that were actually responsible for overseeing employee benefits, recruitment, training, and also performance appraisal as well, and rewarding good work through better pay and benefit systems as well. And those things are still very relevant to the way that we manage schools in particular now. We will talk about them throughout the unit. So HR is all about sort of organisational change, but also those ideas I talked about, industrial relations, and keeping the workforce happy. And then finally, we've got this idea of human capital. So this was actually a term that was popularised by Gary Becker. So he was an economist from the University of Chicago, and also a chap called Jacob Mintzer. And what human capital refers to is the stock of knowledge, habits, social and personality attributes, including things like creativity, embodied in the ability to perform labour. And basically it's making this link between labour and economic value. So again, still relevant to ideas that we talk about today when we're thinking about management of people in education. Right, okay, so thinking point for you. You may want to pause the recording at this point, have a break from me for a second, and to just think about this. So these are two key concepts which underpin this unit, leadership and management. And I'd just like you to pause the recording and consider, what do you understand by these concepts and what are the differences? And what you might draw on is your learning from units from the last teaching block. Okay, so pause the video and I'll see you in a second. Right, another concept that I would like you to think about that underpins this unit is this concept of managerialism. And what we're going to do now is, for the next few slides, we'll explore those three concepts, so leadership, management and managerialism. And we're going to have a little think about what the literature says about some of those ideas. So the difference between leadership and management. So hopefully you've got some ideas about this. This is some ideas by Everard et al. And all of these references will be at the end of the slide set on a reference list. So this is sort of thinking about the difference between these two concepts. So in a nutshell, leadership is concerned with vision, whilst management is concerned with implementation, so making things happen. So leadership is about strategy, whilst management is about operational issues. If you're a leader, then you might be more preoccupied with transformation, whilst if you're a manager, then you might be sort of more preoccupied with the transactional elements of, again, making things happen. Leadership is concerned with the end product and management is more concerned with the way that you get there. Leadership really thinks about people, and whilst management does also think about people, it also considers systems and the way that you can get the most from the people that are working for you. And leadership is about doing the right things, whilst management doing things right. So that's Everard's ideas. And I suppose in a nutshell, the way I would summarize that is to say leadership is about making sure everyone understands the vision of the organisation and buys into that vision, and management is really about making sure people put the vision into action. Just some other quotes here to help us think about what we mean by educational management. So educational management is a field of study and practice concerned with the operation of educational organisations, and it's directed at the achievement of certain educational objectives. And then we've got the ideas of Bush and Bell, which are a little bit old, but still quite relevant. So at its most strategic, management involves formulating a vision for the school based on strongly held values about the aims and purposes of education and translating this into action in specific institutions. So as I mentioned previously, I think this supports the point that I was making about leadership involves the embodiment and articulation of this vision and its communication to others. So just some ideas there, and you need to decide which ones you agree with and why. And then to further distinguish between leadership from management, we've got a couple more quotes here. I'm going to just leave you to read those yourself. I really like that bit in the middle, actually. A simple difference is that management is essentially about ensuring the school runs smoothly, while leadership is about ensuring the school runs somewhere. That's sort of linking in with these ideas of vision. Too much management and a school may only run smoothly on the spot. So it actually doesn't make progress, doesn't improve, and too much leadership, and it may be running all over the place and never smoothly. So I think that's a really nice quote there. So then I've also, I mentioned earlier this concept of managerialism. And I've got, again, a couple of quotes to help us understand what we mean by this idea of managerialism. But this is a concept that's sort of come into being in the 21st century. So if we read this, when management mutated into an ism, it joined a family of isms that indicate an informal, often derogatory and unspecified doctrine, system and practice. In other words, isms are belief systems with a cognitive content that is held up as being true. To turn management into an ism, management needed to come up with a proper ideology. It's become common to see ideology as a set of ideas that constitute goals, expectations, and actions. But what he then goes on to say is that this term managerialism has actually been used quite disparagingly. And it's used disparagingly to sort of imply that some institutions or organizations are overmanaged. So they have this preponderance or excess of managerial techniques, solutions, rules, and personnel. So I suppose on one level, it sort of involves the belief in the value of professional managers. So that's what that first bit sort of says. But what contemporary writers on management have begun to do is to associate this managerialism with a hierarchy and also with an idea of control, which is seen negatively. So you could think of control as being linked to accountability and measurement. But actually, what this implies, these quotes that are on this page, is that it's actually implied that managerialism would suggest overly tightly managed organisations, which actually begins to impede the progress of the organisation itself. So again, this helps us to sort of develop our understanding of this idea of managerialism. So effective leadership and management of schools create structures and processes and establish relationships enabling teachers to engage as fully as possible with teaching and learning. But the term managerialism is normatively and critically conceived as excessive leadership and management, reaching beyond an appropriate educational support role and threatening to become an end in itself. This idea of control. Developing this, if we look at the ideas of Mullins and Christie, they propose managerialism works as sort of clarification of objectives, planning, organising, directing, but then you've got this idea of controlling as well, which I think we can agree is a negative connotation. So if we're thinking about ideas of human resource management, which is another key concept that underpins when we think the theory when we're thinking about management of people in education. What we mean by that, according to Armstrong, is that human resource management is defined as a strategic and coherent approach to the management of an organisation's most valued assets, the people working there who individually and collectively contribute to the achievement of its objectives. So the purpose of human resource management is to ensure that the organisation is able to achieve success through people. And actually, this is sort of bringing the idea in that you've got to have systems in place around working conditions, pay, performance, management, appraisal, and those are managed by a human resource team. So there's this concept of hard versus soft human resource management. So soft human resource management stresses the need to gain the commitment and the hearts and minds of employees. And it's sort of implying the development of a high commitment, high trust organisation. But there's also these ideas of hard human resource management, which are really about regarding employees as a resource to be managed in the same rational way as any other resource being exploited for maximum return. So there's sort of two quite conflicting, there's a tension between those two conceptualizations of human resource management. I really like this one though, because I think this is very true. There can be no single approach to managing people with different motivations, which is likely to be equally successful in all context. And actually, I do believe that context is so important when we're thinking about how you might go about successfully managing people in education. If we wanted to think of an example where this was bound to be true, if you think about the challenges facing schools can be very different. And you might take a very different management approach to managing a school where the staff's very stable, where the teachers are very experienced, and where they've got a very good Ofsted grade, compared to a school where the staff are less stable, so there's poor retention of staff, a high turnover of staff, where it may be more inexperienced, and where the Ofsted grading is low. You can see that those two context management approaches are bound to be very different. So it is really worth thinking about that. And then the other way that I would say that context is very important is in terms of a cultural context. And actually a management approach in one part of the world might be incredibly inappropriate in another part of the world, depending on cultural norms and what's an acceptable way to work compared to another. So that's something we're going to touch on throughout the unit. So this is just sort of some of the headlines and research, and it's actually from 2016. If you're interested in this, then you could go and have a look at this. But this was really about focusing in on the leadership of schools, particularly in relation to head teachers. And actually there was this trend when we, in response to failing schools, to bring in what we describe as super heads, very highly paid heads that were brought in for short periods of time to turn a school around. And depending on the approach, they would use management strategies in very different ways. So this particular piece of research, which I would encourage you to go and have a look at if you are interested in this, and you may well go on to look at something in your assignment for this, that some super heads were described as surgeons. So they had this focus on test scores, and they'd go in and they'd just cut staff and redirect, very decisive and incisive, but once the surgeons left, the exam scores would fall again. Or soldiers who hated waste and believed failing schools were sort of wasting public money, so they would go in and trim the fat, tighten up the systems and focus on the bottom line. So a very different way of managing. Or you'd have superheads that were described as accountants. So they would want to invest in the school, grow the school, and grow the schools out of trouble, maybe by identifying different sources of revenue. So maybe it could be about finding ways of earning money out of hours, for instance. Superheads who are philosophers. So they're focused on alternative teaching methods and pedagogy, classroom practice, but maybe didn't have the greatest impact on student behaviour. And then finally, the other category that Hill and Mellon and Laker and Goddard identified was superheads who were described as architects who redesign, they transform, very visionary and focusing on long-term impact. And so what they would do is probably leave a legacy and actually have an impact after they've gone. So it's a really nice piece of research to focus on if you want to have a sort of lens through which to think about different leadership styles in schools. And then Mitchell and Sackney talk about these differences between managed and living systems in terms of management, which again are really interesting. A managed system is one where you might have a very controlled curriculum which teachers deliver. It's quite predictable, lots of systems in place and a hard approach to human resource management. Whilst living systems, everyone's learning together, both in and out of school. It's a bit more unpredictable, but people are very prioritised and it has a soft approach to human resource management. I'm going to leave you to have a little read of those, but there's a couple more quotes that sort of develop these ideas of this living versus a managed management system. And then finally, I'm actually going to set you a task now, which is a follow-up task from this session around school leadership models. Now, this does rely on me, hopefully you picking different leadership models to focus on. But I have attached a resource to the Blackboard page in the folder for week 1, which describes what these different school leadership models look like. So we've got instructional, managerial, transformational, moral and authentic, distributed, teacher leadership, system leadership, and contingent leadership. So this is what I would like you to do. I'd like you to go to the week 1 folder on Blackboard, pick one of the descriptions of school leadership. They're all up there in one resource. So you just pick the one that you think sounds interesting. And then I want you to prepare a mind map to show the following. So what are the key features of the model? What are the advantages highlighted in the description in the resource that I've put into that folder? What are the disadvantages? And then how is the model regarded in current times? So what I'm going to ask you to do is to swap your mind map models with course mates, and then hopefully what it means you can do is collect a mind map for all the different models to develop your understanding of school leadership models. So here's an example. So that's one that someone's done in the past on contingent leadership, and here's another one where they on teacher leadership. So that you can clearly see the categories that I've talked about. What are the advantages, the disadvantages, key features, and also how is it regarded in current times. So there's a nice model there, don't copy it. So that's not the end of the session. So when you do that, oh, why is it doing that? Hold on, bear with me. Why is it doing that? Right, okay, I'm just going to do it like that. Right, so I've given you a task to do, so I'm hoping that that won't be problematic, not rather than problematic like my sharing of my slides at this point. And then so you're going to share your mind model maps and we can talk about it in a live session on Thursday. So I hope you can still see this. So what I'd like you to do is, if you'd like to, you don't have to, come to the live session on Thursday, this Thursday, the 14th of January. The way that you can access that is by clicking on the live sessions, which is on the left-hand side of the Blackboard page, and then clicking course rooms and then join your course room. That will take you through to the live session. It'll be an informal session where you can meet me, meet course mates, ask questions, and then we'll have a couple of discussion activities where we discuss some of the ideas from this session. In terms of preparation for next week's session or week 2, those can all be found in the week 2 folder. There's a key reading there. There's a leaflet that we would like you to read, and also a pre-preparation task for that session. David's going to be running that session. And then finally, there's a references list. All of these slides are on Blackboard for you as well, so you can have a closer look there if you would like to examine some of these resources in a bit more detail. Okay, I hope to meet some of you on Thursday, and in the meantime, I hope you have a very good week. Take care. Bye.